I bought a Victorian estate in secret to escape my toxic family, but when I walked through the front door 3 days later, I found my mother giving a tour to my sister-in-law and a stranger. I did not scream, and I did not cry. I simply watched from the shadows as they walked through my house, and then I decided to change every lock. My name is Jordan, I am 34 years old, and I have spent my entire life being the bank account for people who despise me. As a senior art appraiser, I know how to spot a fake from a mile away, but it took me decades to realize the biggest frauds were my own mother and brother. I slipped into the grand foyer like a shadow, moving silently across the restored hardwood floors I had just paid a fortune to refinish. That is when I heard the high-pitched, performative voice of Nia, echoing from the formal living room. I peeked around the corner and saw Nia standing in the center of my living room, holding a phone attached to a ring light. She was not just visiting. She was filming a video claiming the house was hers. My mother pointed a manicured finger at the antique fireplace and told a contractor to knock that wall down immediately. She completely ignored historical preservation laws, saying the wall blocked the flow for Kyle's gaming setup. They were literally planning to demolish my house before I had even unpacked a single box. My mother told the man to just get the sledgehammer, explaining that she and Kyle had already discussed how to reorganize the entire ground floor. It was a rhythm of pure rage against my ribs as I listened to them divide up my property. They had clearly manipulated someone to get inside, and now they were treating my sanctuary like a renovation project for my brother's failing career. The audacity was breathtaking, but instead of confronting them right then, I stayed silent. I wanted to see exactly how far they would go before I stepped out and ended their fantasy. I finally stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, my footsteps heavy and deliberate on the hardwood. The contractor was the first to see me, and he immediately lowered his sledgehammer, looking confused and uncomfortable. My mother and Nia froze mid-sentence, the ring light reflecting in their wide, startled eyes. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the hum of the professional camera equipment they had set up in my house without permission. My mother recovered first, smoothing her dress and putting on that forced, condescending smile she used whenever she was caught in a lie. She didn't apologize. Instead, she walked toward me as if I were the guest and she were the host, telling me that I should have called before showing up. Nia was even worse, not even bothering to stop her recording. She looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and pity, as if my presence was an interruption to her grand vision. She started explaining her logic to me, speaking slowly as if I were a child who couldn't understand complex business. She told me that since I was a single woman with no children and no husband, it was completely wasteful and selfish for me to keep a 6-bedroom estate all to myself. She gestured around the formal living room, dismissing my ownership with a wave of her hand. She said that she and Kyle were building a brand and launching a business that would support the entire family, and they needed the ground floor for their studio and the master suite for their public image. Then came the ultimate insult, the moment that made my blood turn to ice. My mother chimed in, saying that they had discussed it thoroughly and decided that I would be much more comfortable in the attic apartment. She said it was only fair since I was gone at work all day anyway. They had already divided the rooms, assigned the master bedroom to Kyle and Nia, and were now telling me that I could stay in the cramped servants' quarters of the house I had paid for with 20 years of my own labor. They stood there, two people who hadn't contributed a single cent to the down payment, and expected me to thank them for the privilege of living in my own attic. I looked at the contractor, who was looking back and forth between us, and I realized he thought I was just the difficult sister in a family project. I looked back at my mother and asked her very quietly, who gave them the right to enter my home? Her face hardened, the mask of the loving mother slipping to reveal the manipulator underneath. She told me not to be dramatic and reminded me that she was my mother, which in her mind meant everything I owned was hers by extension. She told the contractor to ignore me and get back to work on the fireplace. That was the exact moment I realized that talking was useless. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a resource to be harvested. I didn't argue with my mother about the attic, and I didn't try to explain the law to Nia. Instead, I walked over to the contractor and asked him for his business card. He handed it to me, looking relieved to have any professional interaction in that room. I looked him in the eye and told him very clearly that if he struck that wall with a sledgehammer, I would not only sue him for every penny he owned, but I would call the police to report a felony destruction of a historical landmark. The room went silent. The contractor looked at my mother, then at the fireplace, then back at me. He wasn't a fool. He saw the deed of sale on the foyer table earlier, and he realized then that Nancy hadn't been honest about who was paying his invoice. He gathered his tools and walked out without saying another word, leaving my mother and Naya standing in a cloud of their own embarrassment. As the front door closed behind the contractor, my mother's face twisted into a mask of pure venom. She started screaming about how I was embarrassing her and how I was being a cruel sister to Kyle. She brought up the past, reminding me of how she had raised me, but I wasn't listening to the guilt trip anymore. I was thinking about the last 15 years. Since I graduated college, I had been the family's secret safety net. When Kyle crashed his car, I paid the deductible. When my mother's roof leaked, I paid for the shingles. When Nia wanted a designer wedding dress they couldn't afford, I was the one who swiped the card, because they promised it was a loan they would pay back. They never did. They viewed my career as a senior art appraiser, not as a job I worked 60 hours a week for, but as a communal pool of wealth that they were entitled to dip into whenever they felt a whim. Naya stepped forward, her phone still recording, and tried to use her pregnancy as a weapon. She told me that the stress I was causing her was dangerous for the baby, and that I was being incredibly heartless by denying Kyle the space he needed for his career. She actually had the nerve to say that if I didn't let them have the master suite, I would be responsible for their business failing before it even started. I looked at her expensive highlights and her designer handbag, both of which I had likely funded through my mother's constant requests for emergency money, and I felt a wave of nausea. They weren't just parasites. They were parasites who truly believed they were doing me a favor by letting me support them. The final straw came when my mother reached into her bag and pulled out a set of keys. She told me that she had already given a set to Kyle's friends so they could help move the heavy furniture in later that afternoon. They hadn't just scouted the house. They had already initiated a full-scale invasion. They had treated my closing day as their move-in day. I realized then that they had probably followed me to my meetings with the realtor or gone through my mail to find the address. My mother looked at me with a smirk and said that family shares everything, and if I wanted to be part of this family, I needed to learn my place. I didn't say anything. I just turned around, walked out of my own house, and got into my car. They thought they had won because I left the room, but I wasn't retreating. I was going to the one place that would end this forever. I sat in my car in the driveway for a full 10 minutes, watching through the front windows as my mother and Nia moved through the living room, gesturing at my walls as if they were already picking out paint colors. They thought my silence was a sign of submission, but in reality, I was making calls. I first contacted the most expensive locksmith in the city and told him I had an emergency security breach at a historical estate. I told him I needed every exterior door rekeyed and a high-end digital security system installed immediately, and I told him I would pay double the emergency rate if he arrived within the hour. Next, I called my lawyer, a man who had seen me handle the most delicate art fraud cases and knew exactly how much I valued my boundaries. I told him my family had illegally entered my property and were attempting to perform unauthorized construction. While I waited for the locksmith, I pulled up my banking app and did something I should have done years ago. I went through the recurring transfers I had set up for my mother's utilities and Kyle's car insurance. With a few taps, I canceled every single one of them. I watched the status of the accounts change to inactive, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders with every click. I then contacted the real estate office and demanded to know how my family had gained access. The young assistant admitted through stutters that my mother had called claiming I was in the hospital and had sent her to collect the keys for the cleaning crew. It was a calculated, fraudulent lie, and I made sure the assistant knew that a formal complaint against their agency was coming next. The locksmith's van pulled into the driveway just as Kyle's truck arrived, loaded with boxes and a couple of his loud, messy friends. Kyle jumped out of the truck with a grin on his face, acting like he was the man of the house, until he saw me standing by the front door with a professional locksmith carrying a heavy tool bag. The grin vanished. He started yelling before his feet even hit the porch, asking me what I was doing and why there was a van blocking his path. I didn't answer him. I simply directed the locksmith to the front door. My mother and Nia came running out of the house, their faces red with indignation, demanding to know why I was changing the locks on their new home. I stood on the top step and looked down at them, feeling a cold clarity I had never known. I told them that as of this moment, their access to my life and my property was terminated. Kyle tried to push past me, claiming he had a right to be there because Mom said so, but the locksmith stood his ground beside me. I pulled out my phone and showed them the screen, where the police dispatcher was already on the line. I told them they had exactly 5 minutes to remove their ring lights, their cameras, and their bodies from my property before I filed a formal report for trespassing and breaking and entering. The transition from entitled arrogance to shocked silence was instantaneous, but I knew the battle was only just beginning. The 5 minutes I gave them felt like an eternity as the tension on the porch reached a breaking point. Kyle was vibrating with a mixture of embarrassment and rage, his friends standing awkwardly by the truck, realizing they had been recruited for an illegal move-in. My mother tried one last desperate tactic, shifting from anger to a theatrical, shaky-voiced plea. She grabbed my arm and whispered that I was making a scene in front of the neighbors and that I would regret being so cold-hearted when I was old and alone. I pulled my arm back and told her that I would rather be alone in a house I owned than surrounded by people who only loved me for what they could take from me. When the 5-minute mark hit and they were still standing there, I pressed the button on my phone and spoke clearly to the dispatcher, giving my address and stating that I had multiple intruders refusing to leave my property. The arrival of the police car 10 minutes later finally shattered their delusion of ownership. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions neutral but firm, as they walked up the driveway past Kyle's truck. My mother immediately sprinted toward them, her face contorting into a mask of fake distress. She began a frantic, Oscar-winning performance, claiming that I was having a mental breakdown and that they were just there to help me settle in. She pointed at me and told the officers that I was unstable and that she, as my mother, was just trying to protect me from myself. She even had the nerve to say that the house was a family investment and that I was trying to lock them out of their own equity. One of the officers looked at me and asked if I had proof of ownership. I didn't say a word. I simply reached into my bag and handed him the original stamped deed of sale and the closing documents from 3 days ago. I also showed him the text messages from the realtor's assistant, admitting that my mother had lied about me being in the hospital to steal the keys. The officer's demeanor shifted instantly as he read the paperwork. He turned to my mother and told her that according to the state of Georgia, this house belonged to Jordan and Jordan alone. He explained that since there was no lease agreement and no proof of residency for anyone else, they were legally trespassing. The officers gave them 10 minutes to gather their filming equipment and get out. I watched as Nia frantically packed her ring light and camera, her face pale with humiliation, while Kyle cursed under his breath as he tossed his empty boxes back into the truck. My mother stood on the sidewalk, screaming that I was dead to her and that I would never see a cent of her inheritance, which was a laugh considering I was the one who had been funding her lifestyle for a decade. As the locksmith finally began drilling into the old cylinders to install the new high-security deadbolts, the police stayed until Kyle's truck and my mother's car peeled out of the driveway. For the first time in my life, the air inside my home belonged only to me, but I knew that by tomorrow, they would find a way to turn the world against me. The silence that followed their departure was not the peaceful sanctuary I had imagined. It was a heavy, vibrating quiet that felt like the calm before a storm. I spent the rest of the evening watching the locksmith finish the installation and the security team set up high-definition cameras at every entry point. By 10 p.m., my phone began to vibrate against the mahogany nightstand, but it wasn't a call. It was a flood of notifications from social media. I opened my apps and felt my stomach drop into my shoes. Nia had posted a video that was already going viral. She was sitting in what looked like a cheap, dimly lit motel room, wrapped in a thin blanket and looking directly into the camera with wide, tear-filled eyes. The caption of the video was a complete work of fiction designed to destroy my reputation. It read that a multi-millionaire sister-in-law had just kicked her pregnant brother and elderly, sick mother out on the street in the middle of freezing weather because she decided she needed 6 bedrooms all for herself. Nia sobbed for the camera, claiming they had used the last of their meager savings for a motel because I had locked them out of the family home. I scrolled down to the comments and felt a wave of nausea. Thousands of strangers were calling me a monster, a greedy sociopath, and a traitor to my own blood. People were tagging my employer, the art appraisal firm, demanding that I be fired for my lack of basic human decency. My mother joined the fray an hour later, posting a long, rambling message on Facebook about how she had sacrificed everything to raise a daughter who now treated her like a criminal. She didn't mention the lie about the hospital or the stolen keys. She only spoke about her heartbreak and her fear of being homeless. My inbox was suddenly filled with messages from distant relatives and family friends I hadn't spoken to in years, all of them echoing the same sentiment. How could I be so cruel? The digital lynch mob was growing by the second, fueled by Naya's polished influencer tactics and my mother's practiced role as the victim. They were weaponizing the one currency they had left: public sympathy. I sat in my dark, empty living room, the blue light of the phone screen illuminating my face, and realized that they were trying to shame me into submission. They knew that my career as a senior art appraiser relied heavily on my integrity and public image. By painting me as a villain, they were trying to force me to open the doors of the estate just to make the noise stop. They wanted me to call them, apologize, and offer them the master suite as a peace offering. But they didn't understand that after 20 years of being their silent provider, I was no longer afraid of their noise. I took screenshots of every post, every comment, and every threat, and I sent them directly to my lawyer with a single instruction: prepare the cease and desist orders, but don't send them yet. I wanted to see exactly how much rope they would give themselves to hang their own credibility. The next morning arrived with a cold realization that the digital storm had reached my professional life. When I walked into my office at the art appraisal firm, the usual buzz of conversation died down instantly. My boss, a man who typically valued discretion above all else, was waiting for me with a grim expression. He showed me the hundreds of emails and negative reviews that had flooded the company's website overnight, all of them citing Naya's viral video. He told me that while he didn't care about my family drama, he could not have the firm's name dragged through the mud. He suggested I take an unpaid leave of absence until the situation was resolved, which was exactly what my mother and Nia had hoped for. They wanted to strip away my financial independence until I had no choice but to crawl back to them. I didn't argue with my boss because I knew that words would not win this battle. Only cold, hard evidence would suffice. I went back to my new house and spent the afternoon with my lawyer, Helen. We sat at the massive dining table, surrounded by the high-definition security footage from the previous day. The cameras had captured everything: the moment my mother lied to the locksmith, the way Naya practiced her crying face before hitting record on her phone, and most importantly, the clear audio of my mother telling the contractor to destroy the historical masonry. We also compiled 15 years of bank statements, showing exactly how much money I had funneled into their lives, proving that they were far from the starving victims they claimed to be. Instead of a simple cease and desist, Helen drafted a massive defamation and harassment lawsuit. We included the evidence of the identity theft and the fraudulent way they had obtained the keys. I also made a decision that felt like cutting a physical cord. I contacted a local investigative journalist who specialized in social media scams. I told him I had a story about a rising influencer who was weaponizing a fake pregnancy and an elderly mother to commit real estate fraud. I sent him the raw, unedited security footage of them laughing while planning to knock down the fireplace. I wanted the world to see the difference between the POV video Nia posted and the reality of the people who were trying to steal a house. By 5 p.m., the first legal salvos were fired. Process servers were dispatched to the motel, where Nia was still filming her tearful updates. I sat in my quiet library, watching the sunset through the original leaded glass windows, and felt a strange sense of detachment. The phone started buzzing again, but this time, the tone of the notifications was different. The journalist had posted a teaser of the security footage, and the comments were beginning to turn. People were starting to ask why a pregnant woman was planning a demolition and why an elderly mother was participating in a breaking and entering. The narrative was shifting, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one paying for their mistakes. They were. The investigative journalist did not hold back, and the video he released was a masterpiece of digital exposure. He played Naya's tearful motel video on one side of the screen and my high-definition security footage on the other. The public saw Nia laughing as she directed the contractor where to place the ring light. They heard my mother's cold, calculated voice as she ordered the destruction of a historical landmark, that didn't belong to her. Most importantly, the video showed the moment the police arrived, and I handed over the deed. The narrative of the greedy, heartless sister-in-law evaporated in seconds, replaced by the reality of a family of grifters who had been caught red-handed. The digital lynch mob that had been at my throat turned its sights on Nia and Kyle, with a ferocity that was almost terrifying to witness. By the following morning, Nia's social media accounts were gone. She had deactivated everything to escape the tidal wave of vitriol, but the damage was already done. The brands she had been trying to court for partnerships sent out public statements distancing themselves from her, citing her fraudulent behavior and the misuse of her platform. Kyle's friends, who had been so eager to help him move into a mansion, were suddenly nowhere to be found. The motel they were staying in became a fortress of their own making as they realized that they were now the ones who were radioactive. My mother tried to call me 30 times that day, her tone shifting from screaming threats to pathetic begging for me to make the journalist take the video down. But I didn't answer a single one. The professional fallout for them was total. My father's old business associates, who had stayed in touch with my mother out of respect for the past, sent me private messages apologizing for believing her lies. They realized that her claims of being a neglected, elderly mother were a complete fabrication designed to guilt me into silence. My boss at the art appraisal firm called me that afternoon with a completely different tone. He apologized for his initial reaction and asked me to return to work immediately, offering me a senior partnership track as a gesture of goodwill. He admitted that the evidence I had provided was the most thorough debunking of a fraud he had ever seen in his entire career. I stood in the center of my master bedroom, the room they had tried to steal for their brand, and looked at the boxes I was finally beginning to unpack. For the first time, I wasn't just a daughter or a sister or a bank account. I was the owner of my own life. But the most satisfying moment came when Helen, my lawyer, called to tell me that the contractor had come forward. He was terrified of being implicated in the felony destruction of a historical landmark, and was willing to testify that my mother had explicitly told him she owned the property. He provided signed documents and emails that proved the premeditation of their plan. They weren't just looking for a place to stay. They were looking to strip the house of its value and its history to fuel their own delusions. A month had passed since the exposure, and the house had finally begun to feel like a home instead of a crime scene. But the peace was shattered one rainy Tuesday evening when I saw a familiar battered car idling at the end of my driveway. It was my brother Kyle. He didn't look like the confident streamer or the entitled golden child anymore. He looked defeated, his shoulders slumped as he stepped out into the rain and walked toward my porch. I didn't open the door. I watched him through the security camera feed on my tablet. He stood there for a long time, staring at the new digital lock and the reinforced frame, realizing that the physical barriers were now as thick as the emotional ones. When he finally spoke into the intercom, his voice was thin and trembling. He didn't lead with an apology. He led with a crisis. He told me that the motel had kicked them out because their credit cards were being declined. He said that Nia's stress was at an all-time high and that they were truly on the verge of being on the street. He begged me to just let them stay in the guest house for a few weeks until they could figure something out. It was the same old song they had been singing my entire life, the one where my success was the only solution to their failures. He tried to tell me that Mom was sick, that she was depressed, and that it was my responsibility to keep the family together. I waited until he finished his long, rambling plea before I finally pressed the talk button. I told him very clearly that the person he was looking for, the sister who solved every problem and paid every bill, had died the moment they brought a sledgehammer into my living room. I told him that I had already spent over $40,000 on legal fees and security upgrades because of their actions, and that money would have been more than enough for them to find a modest apartment of their own. I reminded him that they didn't want a roof over their heads. They wanted my life, and that was the one thing I was never going to give them again. Kyle started to shout, his desperation turning back into the familiar rage, but I simply cut the connection. I watched on the monitor as he kicked a decorative planter on the porch, and then realized the police would be there in minutes if he didn't leave. He slunk back to his car and drove away into the rain. An hour later, my lawyer sent over the final draft of the permanent restraining orders. We were no longer just talking about a civil lawsuit for defamation. We were creating a legal iron curtain that would prevent them from ever coming within 500 feet of me or my property again. The cost of their betrayal was total exile, and for the first time, I didn't feel a single spark of guilt. 6 months after the final court date, the dust had finally settled on the ruins of my family's reputation. I sat in my library, the fire crackling in the antique fireplace that they had once tried to destroy. The room was filled with the scent of old paper and the quiet safety I had bought with my own courage. My mother and Kyle were gone from my life, moved to a small rental in a different county, living the modest life they had spent decades trying to avoid through my labor. The restraining orders were permanent, and the legal settlement had stripped them of the last of their unearned assets to pay back the damages for the defamation. They were no longer a threat. They were just a memory of a life I had finally outgrown. People think a house is just an investment made of bricks and mortar, but they are wrong. This estate became my physical manifestation of the word no. Every brick in the wall was a boundary I had finally found the strength to set, and every locked door was a refusal to be used ever again. I realized that my true victory wasn't winning the court case or restoring the historical woodwork. My victory was the realization that my peace of mind was more valuable than their approval. I had spent years confusing love with enabling, believing that being a good daughter meant shielding my family from the consequences of their own greed. I finally understood that when you feed a parasite, it does not become grateful. It only becomes hungrier. The most profound lesson I learned from this war was that DNA is not a suicide pact. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep others warm, especially when those people are the ones holding the matches. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit driveway that was now empty and quiet. I raised a glass to the reflection in the window, to the woman who had survived the guilt, the shame, and the betrayal of the people who were supposed to protect her. The daughter who served as a bank account was dead, and the woman who owned herself had finally moved in. As I reached into my pocket and felt the heavy brass key against my palm, I knew that the story of Jordan the victim was over. This house was no longer just a building. It was a fortress of freedom. I turned off the lights and walked up the grand staircase, not to the attic they had tried to banish me to, but to the master suite that I had earned with every hard-worked hour of my life. The silence was no longer heavy. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I was finally home, and for the first time in my life, I was truly safe.